This is one of several graphs appearing in a report completed in mid-2024 and which are produced with the help of valuable inputs from a number of people from a few different organizations. Here's the title of the report. By the time you watch this video, it's likely the report will be published online. Of course, what you're about to see is something I produced and is not necessarily representative of how any of these organizations see things. Let's start understanding this graph. Along the horizontal axis, we have the percentage of all of Africa's children. Straightforward. The percentage proficient you see here along the vertical axis is the percentage of learners at the end of primary school who have the knowledge and skills they should have using standards set by UNESCO and used for the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. This across subject means the average across the two SDG subjects, namely reading and mathematics, was used. Using this average across the two can be useful. It helps deal with the problem where, as in Burkina Faso, one international assessment program interprets the standards more leniently for reading, while another interprets the standards for mathematics more leniently. What about this line? This represents Africa's countries. But given there's so many countries on the continent, many of the smaller ones in terms of population are not labeled. Countries are sorted according to the average proficiency level of each country's learners. Let's take Ethiopia as an example. This country is a little above the middle of the continent's distribution. And Ethiopia's line is fairly long, as Ethiopia's children are 9% of all of Africa's children. 12% of Ethiopia's end of primary learners reach at least the level of proficiency expected by the SDGs. But is this about children or learners, you may now be asking? The proficiency levels shown here are about learners enrolled at the end of primary schooling. This is how the SDGs work. They concentrate on learners in school, but I've used the number of children to determine the length of each country's line. So strictly speaking, this graph shows what quality of schooling children across Africa's countries potentially have access to. Of course, some children would not be in school. For example, the numbers I used for the analysis indicate that a whole 31% of Ethiopia's children do not reach the end of primary school. For the rest of Africa, the figure is 24%. In other words, around 76% of Africa's children do reach the end of primary. If we assume that children who do not reach the end of primary do not achieve end of primary proficiency level, then this line would drop a bit. To provide a couple more numbers, if one counts only learners in schools, then 13% across all of Africa are proficient. And if we count all children, assuming those not reaching the end of primary do not achieve end of primary proficiency, then the figure drops to 11%. Most of the work in the analysis I did was about getting sufficiently comparable numbers for as many African countries as possible. There's no one international testing system that assesses learners across the continent in one uniform manner. There are all these assessment programs, at least some of which probably look familiar to you. What helps is that many countries participate in more than one testing program, which then helps you to adjust statistics so they roughly use the same standard. As I wanted to use the UNESCO standards, my point of departure was programs which appear aligned to those standards quite well. Of course, this is not going to bring about perfect comparability. It's all about sufficient comparability to permit informed discussions. Others have done this kind of harmonization work before for the whole world, so there were earlier methods I could build on and adapt. The benefits of the new estimates include the fact that they use more recent data. Moreover, the new estimates use adjustments where in the same program, different countries tested different grades, something I don't think earlier work has taken into account. One thing I avoided was using non-education data like income data to estimate learning levels where education data were not available. By using quite a broad range of sources, it was possible to cover all countries except for 8. The 47 countries which are covered in this graph have 97% of Africa's children. The labels in red refer to countries where EGRA data had to be used, as there was no better data source. Now, EGRA is not really aimed at producing statistics which are comparable across countries. So EGRA was clearly the least reliable source, but it seemed better to use EGRA than to leave more countries out. So to be clear then, 100% here is actually 97% of all the continent's children. Now, the values for many countries are really awfully low. For instance, 2% of learners being proficient in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Why is this figure so low? Well, the data we have do suggest that there's much less learning in the schools of the DRC than in, say, the schools of Kenya or even Ethiopia. But perhaps one could argue that the standards UNESCO has set are a bit ambitious. To illustrate, in Finland, in 2023, only 76% of learners at the end of primary mastered the mathematics they should have mastered. A quarter of Finland's learners do not display the skills they should. If this is what we see in Finland, well, then the 38% we see here for Morocco does not sound that bad. Now, why is this kind of information important? Here some history helps. Before around 2000, economists were frustrated that they were not able to predict economic growth better. But how were they measuring education in their models? They were looking at, for instance, levels of participation in primary schooling across the world. The economists assumed that, say, reaching grade 6 in the DRC and reaching grade 6 in Kenya meant roughly similar skills were obtained. But was that assumption right? Starting in around 2000, economists started putting into their models not just participation levels, but levels of actual learning. One reason they could do this is that more data across more countries on learning were becoming available. They were surprised to see how strongly levels of learning predicted economic growth. In fact, what children learned at school seemed to be the main factor determining how developed a country became. A lot of people were excited about this new evidence. It helped education planners understand how incredibly important it was to monitor and promote learning. UNESCO's 2005 EFA report is a good place to see this excitement over these new realizations. 10 years later, when the SDGs were put together, they focused strongly on measuring and improving what children actually learn at school. The earlier Millennium Development Goals had not included this and had focused on participation. So, in summary, all this matters because a country's human capabilities are central to its development, and the only way of really improving those capabilities on a large scale is by getting schooling right from the earliest ages. Unfortunately, too many African countries have lacked the regular monitoring required to see whether learning outcomes or proficiency are improving. Some countries have participated in rather successful assessment programs which do allow us to monitor trends reliably over time. This is true for countries that have participated in PASEC and those in SIACMEC. The kinds of comparisons across countries you see in this graph, while important, are perhaps less important than trends over time in individual countries. If you see improvement in your country, you know something you are doing must be right. If there's no improvement, you need to rethink your strategies, no matter how good they may appear on paper. Improvement is certainly possible in Africa. The 2024 McKinsey report on global education referred to 3 developing countries in the world, which they called sustained and outsized improvers, based on trends seen in international testing programs. One country was Peru, the other 2 African, South Africa and Morocco.